Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever stopped to wonder why kids from, say, similar backgrounds can turn out so differently?
hmm
Or maybe how your own upbringing, keeps shaping you even now as an
Oh,
adult?
yeah, definitely.
Today, we're plunging into this, incredibly complex web of influences that shape how a child develops. Because it's far, far more than just what happens inside, like one single home.
That's absolutely right. We're drawing on quite a stack of sources here. We've got research in developmental theories, sociology, cultural studies,
Okay.
plus some specific work looking at family involvement in education, and even how children make theological meaning in different communities.
Wow, okay.
And what these sources really show us, taken together, is that a child's life is this constant interplay. It's psychological stages, sure, but also societal forces, cultural norms, and those really personal interactions. It's all mixed together.
Right. So our mission today, we want to pull out the sharpest insights, maybe the most surprising nuggets from all this material, just to give you a clearer picture of these, complex dynamics.
Trying to understand the why behind it all.
Exactly. Why things unfold the way they do. Okay, let's unpack this. When we think about families and the kids growing up in them, where do we even begin to make sense of all these different forces at play?
Well, a really foundational place the sources point to is Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory.
Bioecological systems.
Okay.
Yeah. And the core idea is pretty powerful, actually. It says development isn't just some internal clock ticking away or something that just happens to a child.
Uh-huh.
It's a product of this constant back and forth, this interaction between the individual and a whole series of nested contexts, or ecologies, as he calls them.
Nested contexts, so like layers.
Exactly. Think of it like, an onion is one way, or maybe those Russian nesting dolls.
Ah, okay, get that visual.
The innermost layer is the microsystem. That's the child's immediate face-to-face world. So family, school, their peer group.
Right, the direct stuff. Then the next layer out, the mesosystem. This one's fascinating. It's not just the settings themselves, but the connections and interactions between them.
Oh, interesting. Like how school and family connect.
Precisely. How engaged are parents with the school? How do friendships affect what happens at home? That sort of thing. That's the mesosystem.
So it's not just the place, but how the places interact. Got it.
Yep. And then you zoom out further. The exosystem includes settings the child isn't even in directly, but they still feel the effects.
Like what?
Maybe a parent's workplace, policies on leave, or the stress level there,
Right.
or local community resources, things like libraries or parks.
Okay, so stuff that affects the parents affects the kids indirectly.
Exactly. And the outermost layer is the macrosystem. This is the big picture stuff.
Yeah.
The broader cultural values, the laws, the economy, political systems, social norms.
Wow, so it goes from the kid's bedroom right out to, like, global economics.
Pretty much. And the real insight of this whole model, the sources stress, is that you can't just blame developmental outcomes on the child or even just the immediate family. That misses the vast majority of the picture.
Right.
Everything from national policy down to a parent's job stress can ripple inwards and influence that child's world.
That really throws out the simple nature or nurture idea, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's more like nature within nurture within all these layers of context.
Precisely. It's much more dynamic.
So Bronfenbrenner gives us this layered framework. What about other key thinkers the sources bring up? Are there other foundational ideas we should touch on?
Yeah, briefly, the material does mention others who add pieces to this puzzle. You've got Freud, of course, focusing on early experiences. Though the sources are quick to note, there's not really solid empirical evidence for his specific psychosexual stages.
Okay.
Then there's Erikson. He built on Freud, but went in a pretty different direction, looking at personality developing across the whole lifespan.
Not just childhood.
Right. He framed it as navigating these social tasks at different stages, balancing our own desires with what society expects. Much more social focus.
That makes sense, seeing development as a lifelong social negotiation.
Yes. And Piaget also highlighted how crucial social interactions are, but more for cognitive development, how kids sort of construct their understanding by wrestling with their internal world and their social experiences.
Okay.
And then there's Vygotsky with his sociocultural theory. He really emphasized that development is deeply dependent on interacting with other people and using the cultural tools available, things like language, symbols, technology.
So interaction and culture are key for Vygotsky.
Absolutely. But one thing from Erikson that's particularly relevant for our topic today It's this really powerful insight that it's not just the child who's developing.
Yeah.
Every member of the family is going through their own developmental stages at the same time, and that inevitably affects everyone else in the system.
Oh, wow, that's a crucial point. The family isn't static. It's this system of people all on their own journeys, bumping into each other developmentally.
Exactly.
As they're all navigating these journeys, how do kids learn the unwritten rules, how the world works? That sounds like socialization.
That's the term, yes. Socialization is that really fundamental process where individuals, especially kids, internalize the norms, the values, the ideas of their society.
It's how culture gets passed down.
Basically, yes. It ensures some level of continuity, and it happens through interaction with various agencies or institutions.
And I'm guessing the family is agency number one.
According to the sources, absolutely.
Yeah.
The most important, arguably, the parents' values, their behaviors, their beliefs, they're profoundly influential, especially early on.
Sure.
But here's where Bronfenbrenner's layers come back in again. Families don't socialize children in a vacuum.
Right, the context matters.
Hugely. Factors like the historical period, the sources mention, like using a wooden spoon for discipline being more acceptable, say, 60 years ago than today, or things like race, social class, religion, these all shape how families socialize. Are they pushing obedience or creativity? What about specific gender roles? It varies massively depending on these broader social contexts that influence the family unit.
That wooden spoon example really drives home how much norms can shift over time. I saw another fascinating example in the source about Swedish paternity leave.
Oh, yeah, that's a fantastic illustration of how policy itself acts as a socialization agent.
Oh, so?
Well, Sweden offers really generous subsidized leave, 480 days, and it's shareable between parents. And the sources note that something like 90% of fathers actually use some of this leave, averaging about 7 weeks.
Wow, 7 weeks average. That's different from the U.S., typically.
Very different. And the really important question this raises is, how might children growing up in Sweden seeing fathers much more involved in daily early childcare as a norm? How might they be socialized differently about parental roles and gender expectations compared to kids in cultures where that's less common or supported? It shows policy isn't just some dry regulation. It actively shapes norms, family life, and what kids learn about how the world works.
It really makes you think about those subtle messages societies send, or sometimes not so subtle. Okay, so beyond the family, what other key places do kids learn the rules of the game?
Well, peers become increasingly important as kids get older. They offer a different kind of socialization, different perspectives, and social support.
Sure, friends become huge.
And schools, of course, are another major agency. They don't just teach academics, right? They teach citizenship, national identity. Think about things like the Pledge of Allegiance in the U.S. or how history is taught. The sources even mention how textbooks evolve over time to reflect changing perspectives, like being more honest about past injustices towards minority groups.
That's a point.
And then for adults, the workplace is a huge socializer. We learn professional norms, how to use the equipment that's material culture, but also the non-material stuff, like how to interact with the boss, with colleagues, even where it's okay to eat lunch.
Right, the company culture.
Yeah.
That point about schools teaching more than just reading and writing. The sources mention something called the hidden curriculum.
Yes, exactly. That's a concept highlighted in the material. The hidden curriculum is all the unstated lessons kids learn in school alongside the formal subjects.
Like what kinds of lessons?
Things like norms for behavior, how to respect authority, managing your time, understanding social hierarchies within the classroom. It's all that underlying structure of school life that shapes them just as much, if not more sometimes, than the actual lessons.
Okay, so socialization's happening constantly across all these different layers and places. And underpinning all these rules and expectations is, well, culture itself.
Right. Culture is basically the shared way of life of a group of people. And the sources break it down nicely into material culture and non-material culture.
Material is the physical stuff.
Yeah, the objects, the things you can touch, buildings, clothes, tools, technology. Non-material culture is the intangible stuff. The ideas, beliefs, values, attitudes, and importantly, the norms.
Interconnected.
Always linked. Objects often carry symbolic meaning, right? And our norms dictate how we use those objects or interact with them.
The commuting examples in the source really brought that home for me.
They're great examples, like the simple act of catching a bus.
Yeah.
The sources point out how dramatically the rules, the norms, vary.
How so?
In Dublin, you might need to wave your arm clearly to signal the bus to stop. In Cairo, maybe the bus doesn't even come to a complete stop. You sort of hop on. In Mumbai, you might face intense crowds on train platforms, and pushing is just part of getting on board.
Wow.
These aren't just like practical differences. They reflect deeper cultural norms about personal space, politeness, efficiency, how you interact with strangers.
That's a really vivid picture of non-material culture in action. With all this variation, are there any things that are basically the same across all cultures? Any human universals?
It's a great question, and interestingly, yes. The sources mention the anthropologist George Murdoch, who identified several cultural universals.
Like what? Besides basic survival needs, I guess.
Yeah. Well, beyond the obvious, like needing food and shelter, he found universals like language. Every culture has it, though obviously different ones. Personal names, shared experiences around birth and death, and, maybe surprisingly, jokes.
Jokes. Seriously, humor is universal.
Apparently so.
Hmm.
Murdoch saw humor as a universal way to navigate tension, release stress, and create social bonds. Kind of a necessary tool for human interaction, regardless of the specific cultural context.
Huh. Jokes is a fundamental part of being human. That's kind of cool, actually. But okay, with all this cultural difference, it must be easy to misunderstand or misjudge other cultures.
Extremely easy. And that brings us to concepts like ethnocentrism. That's judging other cultures using your own culture's standards as the measuring stick, often thinking yours is superior.
Right, seeing everything through your own lens.
Exactly. And the opposite, though maybe less common, is xenocentrism, believing another culture is superior to your own.
Okay, so what's the goal then for someone trying to understand different cultures?
The approach sociologists strive for, as the sources discuss, is cultural relativism. That means trying to understand and assess a culture based on its own standards, its own values, its own context.
Okay, trying to see it from the inside out. But wait, what if a culture's standards allow for something that seems, well, fundamentally wrong from an outside perspective? The sources brought up female genital mutilation as a really difficult example. How do scholars handle that tension if you're judging by their standards?
That is precisely the challenge, the difficult edge that the sources highlight. Cultural relativism demands an open mind, right? An awareness of your own biases. But, and this is crucial, it doesn't mean blindly accepting everything without any critical reflection.
Okay.
It means striving to understand the practice within its cultural context, why it exists, what meanings it holds there, while also potentially acknowledging its harmful impacts and critiquing it, often from a different ethical framework, like universal human rights.
Well, it's understanding without necessarily condoning.
Exactly. It's a constant, really difficult balancing act. You have to be aware of your own cultural baggage while trying to appreciate another culture critically.
That tension seems unavoidable when you're really grappling with human diversity. Okay, and underpinning all this daily life within a culture are those unwritten rules we keep mentioning, norms.
Right. Norms are the specific rules and expectations that guide behavior. And the sources mention these things called breaching experiments.
Breaching experiments, what are those?
They're fascinating, actually. It's when researchers deliberately violate a minor social norm to see how people react. The classic example is facing the wrong way in an elevator.
Oh my God, facing the back wall, that sounds incredibly awkward.
It's excruciating, right? But doing things like that instantly reveals how much we rely on these invisible rules and how much discomfort and confusion arises when they're broken. It shows the scaffolding of social order.
Totally. You just know not to do that. So are all norms equally important?
No, they vary in intensity. The sources distinguish between mores and folkways.
Mores and folkways.
Koas have strong moral weight. They're often tied to a group's core values, and violating them has serious consequences. Think laws against murder or academic rules against plagiarism. They uphold critical social standards.
Got it. Serious stuff.
Folkways, on the other hand, are the everyday customs and conventions. There's no real moral underpinning. It's things like how you greet someone, handshake, hug, bow, how close you stand when talking, what you wear to a casual gathering.
Like holding the door open for someone.
Exactly. Or saying bless you when someone sneezes. Violating a folkway might make you seem rude or weird, but it's not seen as immoral. And learning the folkways of a new culture or region, like the sources mention, knowing whether it's common to chat with strangers in the southern U.S. versus maybe other places, that's key to fitting in and overcoming culture shock.
Right. Knowing the little things can make a big difference.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got culture, norms, socialization.
Yeah.
Let's shift a bit to something more internal, our attitudes.
Yeah.
How do our personal evaluations shape things, especially within families?
Okay, so an attitude, in social psychology terms, is basically an enduring evaluation of something. Could be a person, an object, an idea, like your attitude towards recycling or towards a political candidate or towards Brussels sprouts.
Right, and some attitudes feel stronger than others.
Exactly. Attitude strength varies quite a bit.
So what makes an attitude stronger? Why do we feel more strongly about some things than others?
Well, the sources point to a few key factors. Direct experience is a big one. If you've actually struggled to solve a difficult puzzle yourself, your attitude towards that type of puzzle might be stronger than if you just read about it.
Makes sense. Doing it makes it real.
Right. Also, simply thinking about, expressing, or discussing an attitude tends to strengthen it. The more you engage with it, the more embedded it becomes.
Okay.
And another interesting factor is when an attitude gets linked to your self-concept. The sources mention studies where people are more likely to act in line with their attitudes if they see themselves in a mirror or know they're being filmed. It activates that self-awareness.
Huh. So seeing yourself reminds you of yourself and your beliefs.
Kind of, yeah. And attitudes are generally strongest when their three components all line up. The affective component, your feelings about it, the behavioral component, how you tend to act towards it, and the cognitive component, your thoughts and beliefs about it.
ABC, affective behavioral cognitive.
Exactly. Think about, say, strong national pride, where you feel good about your country, you participate in national events, and you believe in its values. That's high alignment. Compare that to maybe your attitude towards chocolate ice cream. You love the taste, affective, you eat it often, behavioral, but you know it's not healthy, cognitive. That conflict makes the overall attitude a bit weaker or more complex.
That's a great way to think about it. Alignment equals strength. But do our attitudes always predict how we'll actually behave? Seems like sometimes people say one thing and do another.
Yes, the attitude-behavior consistency question. And the sources show it's definitely not as straightforward as we might assume. There's a classic study mentioned about strawberry jam that illustrates this perfectly.
Strawberry jam. Okay, I'm listening.
So, people tasted different jams and rated how much they liked them. Simple enough. One group just gave their overall preference basically an affective judgment, how it tasted.
Right.
Another group was asked to think carefully about the reasons why they liked or disliked each jam before rating it. So they were pushed towards a cognitive judgment.
Okay, analyzing the jam.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. When researchers later compared these ratings to expert taste test ratings, the people who just went with their gut feeling the affective group their ratings were actually more consistent with the experts. The group that thought about the reasons made judgments that were less valid compared to their own initial affective response.
Wait, so thinking harder about why you like the jam makes you worse at judging how much you actually like it. That seems completely backwards.
Isn't it wild? It suggests that the very act of cognitively dissecting something that's primarily driven by feeling, by affect, can actually interfere with or distort your judgment. There's another study mentioned, too, about how alcohol can influence judgment of risky behavior on a date scenario. The point is, context matters. Whether you're focused on the thinking part or the feeling part can really change whether your stated attitude lines up with your eventual behavior.
That's fascinating, and slightly worrying about relying too much on rational analysis sometimes. Okay, bringing this back to families, how do attitudes, say, about things like gender, play out in family structures and dynamics?
Well, gender roles are a prime example. These are society's expectations for how people should behave, think, and feel based on their sex. And the sources really emphasize that gender is a social construction.
Meaning it's learned, not just biological.
Exactly. We learn these expectations for masculinity and femininity from a very young age through all those socialization agents we talked about, and we internalize them to form our gender identity. Think about old nursery rhymes or the classic example of dressing baby girls in pink and baby boys in blue. The signals start incredibly early.
Yeah, it's woven into everything from day one.
The sources also briefly mention sexual orientation research.
Yes, just noting that while there's no single scientific consensus on the exact causes, research continues to explore biological factors, hormonal influences. They mention things like CAH, which is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and studies on prenatal androgen exposure as areas being investigated. Sounds good.
Yeah.
And there was also discussion of LGBT parenting.
Right. The material defines it, same-sex couples raising kids, single LGBT parents, families where one partner is LGBT, and talks about the various ways people in the community become parents through relationships, co-parenting arrangements, adoption, donor conception methods. It also references U.S. Census data trying to estimate the number of children living in same-sex couple households.
Okay. And families, regardless of their structure, obviously aren't static, right?
Yeah.
They change over time.
Absolutely. Even a traditional nuclear family evolves constantly. Parents meet, have kids, the kids grow up, maybe leave home. Parents themselves are going through their own life stages. The sources briefly mention one stage of parenthood called the image-making stage. That's even before having a child, when prospective parents start forming ideas and expectations about what being a parent will be like.
The dreaming phase.
Sort of, yeah. But even how families form in the first place isn't universal. The material contrasts typical Western courtship patterns with practices like arranged marriage, which is still common in some cultures.
Like where?
They mention examples like India or the phenomenon of the Shanghai marriage market. And the sources present the arguments often made for and against it, balancing individual choice and romantic love against ideas of parental wisdom, family compatibility, or social stability.
That highlights a massive cultural difference in just the starting point of a family.
Yeah.
What about newer trends, like couples living together before marrying?
Right, cohabitation. Living together unmarried has become much, much more common globally, especially prevalent in places like the Scandinavian countries. And the sources pose this interesting question. Is cohabitation becoming like a new developmental step, a standard part of the relationship progression before marriage rather than just an alternative to it?
Is it?
Well, the data is mixed. Many cohabiting relationships do lead to marriage, but a significant number also end without marriage. So it's not quite a settled stage yet, perhaps.
Okay, so families are structured differently. They evolve, they form in culturally varied ways. Now, within these families, how do different ways of parenting affect the kids, the parenting styles?
Yeah, the sources introduce Diana Baumrien's influential work on parenting styles. Her model is based primarily on two dimensions: responsiveness, which is about warmth, support, being attuned to the child's needs, and demandingness, which is about setting expectations, rules, and limits.
Responsiveness and demandingness. Okay.
And the sources emphasize it's the combination of these, not just having one or the other. Plus, they add another important dimension that later research highlighted: psychological control.
Psychological control, what does that mean?
It refers to intrusive attempts by parents to control a child's thoughts and feelings, often using things like guilt trips, shaming, or withdrawing love to manipulate behavior. It's distinct from behavioral control, which is about setting reasonable limits on actions.
Got it. So what are the main styles based on these dimensions?
Well, the key contrast often drawn is between authoritarian and authoritative parenting.
Okay. Authoritarian versus authoritative. They sound similar.
They do, but they're very different in practice. Both are actually high in demandingness. They both set clear expectations and rules.
Right.
But authoritarian parents are also high in psychological control and low in responsiveness. They expect unquestioning obedience, often have rigid rules, and are generally not open to discussion. Because I said so is kind of the motto.
Okay, strict controlling.
Whereas authoritative parents, while also high in demandingness, are crucially low in psychological control and high in responsiveness. They provide explanations for rules, they're willing to listen to the child's perspective, they're warm and supportive, but they still maintain firm boundaries.
So high expectations, but with warmth and reasoning.
Exactly. It's generally seen as the most beneficial style in many Western cultural contexts. The sources also briefly mention analogies sometimes used, like the overly permissive pal, parent, low demanding, low control, or the police officer, drill sergeant. High demanding, high control, focus solely on obedience, similar to authoritarian.
That distinction, especially highlighting the psychological control aspect, feels really key for a child's sense of autonomy and self-worth. Now, the sources also had to address a very difficult, darker side of family life: child abuse.
Yes, unfortunately, the material does cover this complex and devastating issue. It stresses that abuse can happen in any kind of family across all socioeconomic levels, races, etc.
But are there risk factors?
Yes, factors like poverty, high parental stress, social isolation, and substance abuse are often correlated with higher risk. The sources also touch on the complex reasons why adults might stay in abusive relationships themselves, things like learned helplessness, genuinely hoping the abuser will change, shame, guilt, fear, and often economic dependence.
It's incredibly complicated. And the impact on children?
Severe and often long-lasting. The sources detail a range of impacts: behavioral issues like acting out, aggression, or becoming withdrawn, emotional problems like depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, difficulties in school, and even physiological effects.
Physiological, like physical health.
Yes. Chronic stress from abuse can lead to higher levels of stress hormones, which can potentially impact brain development, weaken the immune system, and contribute to learning and memory difficulties down the line. It's profound. And a crucial point the sources make is that neglect, the failure to provide for a child's basic needs, while often less visible than physical abuse, is actually more common.
That's vital to remember. Neglect is abuse, too. Are there other trends mentioned about how modern families are structured or adapting?
Yeah, a couple of interesting ones. The phenomenon of boomerang kids.
Boomerang kids.
Young adults, often in the 25-34 age range, who return home to live with their parents after having lived independently, often driven by economic factors, student debt, unstable job market, high housing costs.
Right, I've heard of that. It seems more common now.
It does. And relatedly, the sources mention an increase in multi-generational households, where you might have aging parents living with their adult children and grandchildren. Sometimes it's out of financial necessity, sometimes cultural preference, often a mix.
So the picture of the typical family is really shifting.
Definitely. So summing up this section, parenting isn't one size fits all. It involves diverse patterns, it changes as kids develop, it influences both the child and the parent, and it's all happening within these evolving family structures facing very real modern pressures.
Right, it's all part of that dynamic system Bronfenbrenner talked about at the start.
Exactly.
Okay. Wow. We've covered a lot of ground. Foundational theories, how socialization works through different agents, the deep influence of culture and norms, how attitudes form and affect behavior, and the complex dynamics within families, including parenting styles and modern challenges. Let's try to bring some of these threads together now, looking specifically at how families, culture, and communities intersect in practice, especially around learning. The education and church study sources seem key here.
Yes, the education source offers a really critical perspective, particularly on the U.S. context. It notes this strong tendency in the United States to place immense responsibility on schools, especially when it comes to addressing the disadvantages faced by some children.
Why is that? Why such a heavy focus on schools here?
The source suggests several reasons. Maybe a historical antipathy towards other forms of social welfare, a strong belief in education as the primary hand-up or path to mobility, sometimes perspectives rooted in older ideas about cultural deprivation being the cause of poverty, and also the role of schools in the civil rights movement as a site for promoting equality. But the really crucial point the source makes is that this intense focus on schools can inadvertently obscure or lead us to underestimate the incredibly significant role that family background and involvement actually play in a child's educational journey.
So, by focusing only on fixing schools, we might be missing huge barriers that families themselves are facing.
Precisely. The sources detail some of these very real concrete barriers, especially for economically disadvantaged families. There's the sheer emotional and mental strain of living in poverty, which can impact parenting practices, making them perhaps harsher or less consistent.
The stress factor.
Lack of access to educational resources at home, books, computers, quiet study space, enrichment activities, and significant language gaps. The sources mention the famous Hart and Risley study showing a huge difference in the number of words heard by age 3 between children from different socioeconomic backgrounds.
What gap, right?
Yes. And Leroux's work on different patterns of dialogue and interaction between parents and children. Plus, there are just practical, logistical barriers. Lack of reliable transportation, inflexible work schedules, making it impossible to attend school meetings or events.
Okay, these are major hurdles.
Absolutely. And the course argues that addressing these barriers isn't just about, helping poor families. It's actually crucial for making the whole education system itself more effective. Educational success is deeply linked to having adequate social welfare supports for families. They briefly mention things like conditional caste transfer pilot programs or parent information and resource centers, PRCs, as examples of trying to bridge that gap.
That completely reframes the challenge. It's not just schools or families, it's the connection between them and the support systems around them. Now let's pivot to that church study. This gives us a really unique window into how a specific cultural context shapes learning and understanding, right?
Yeah.
Particularly around something complex like theological meaning-making in kids.
Yes, this study is fascinating. It looked closely at children in 4 different congregations, and it beautifully illustrates how the kids' ways of thinking about God and faith really reflected the specific cultures, values, and theological approaches of their particular church communities.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. At Parkdale, which was described as very diverse and valuing multiple voices, the children's drawings of Jesus were equally diverse, They showed him healing, emitting light, having different appearances. One boy, Jacob, drawing on a summer camp experience where they discussed welcoming difference, even described a dragon god. Not scary, but representing wrestling with big ideas.
A dragon god. Wow. That really shows kids are actively integrating stuff from everywhere, not just church on Sunday.
Exactly, they're active meaning makers. Then, at Messiah, a congregation with strong Ghanaian roots emphasizing interconnectedness and contextualizing faith, one boy, Luke, really pushed back against the idea of only one way to believe, arguing for multiple valid perspectives. Another girl, Dawn, saw her dreams as a legitimate source of theology, a way God communicated with her.
Dreams as theology.
Yeah. And Marion had this amazing idea about Jesus' skin color being like all colors combined, connecting it to God creating everyone, directly challenging the typical white depiction she saw.
That's powerful. What about the other churches?
At Burke Strait, which emphasized reason and a more speculative approach to theology, you had kids like Denise questioning if faith meant having to turn off your brain. Another boy, Nicholas, was quite open about his doubts, saying he thought the resurrection story was probably fiction, while Jeremy, another boy there, seemed comfortable embracing mystery and not needing definitive answers. And Rebecca, perhaps reflecting her age and the specific teaching she received, had a theology very focused on God loves you and is all around you, but also showed a very literal interpretation of Bible stories.
So the community's specific culture wasn't just like background noise. It actively shaped the kinds of questions kids asked and the ways they felt comfortable thinking about God.
Absolutely. And then the fourth church, Colkirk, an Aboriginal congregation, focused on relational theology and healing from historical trauma. Their children's theology was described as being felt more than spoken, deeply rooted in their relationships with each other, with the land, with their history. One girl, Ally, just radiated this relational understanding of faith.
Oh, more than spoken.
Yeah, and this study powerfully shows kids aren't just empty vessels waiting to be filled with religious ideas. They are active theologians constructing meaning. And crucially, they draw on multiple sources, yes, their congregation, but also parents, school, friends, media, camps, even dreams, as we saw. And they use diverse methods telling stories, asking critical questions, dialogue, personal experience, grappling with mystery, interpreting dreams.
That's so much more complex than just learning beliefs.
Right. The source even briefly touches on a critique of how multiculturalism is sometimes handled, that it can accidentally stereotype non-dominant groups or treat culture like a static object for display, creating an insider-outsider feeling. These kids, navigating multiple cultural inputs, implicitly challenge that static view.
That critique feels really important. Culture isn't a museum piece. It's lived, it's messy, it changes. So thinking about this church study, what's maybe one core takeaway that applies to learning and development more broadly, beyond just theology?
I think a really powerful finding, relevant to all kinds of learning, is the critical importance of relationships and conversation.
How so?
Well, the way the Colkirk children's theology was so deeply relational felt more than spoken, and the observation across all the congregations that children often made meaning best while talking about things, they sometimes struggled to articulate clear ideas when asked directly, like in an interview, outside of that conversational flow.
Ah, so the process of talking it out is part of the learning itself.
Exactly. It underscores just how vital it is to foster opportunities for genuine discussion, for back and forth within strong, trusting relationships. That's how kids, and probably adults too, process information, explore complex ideas, and build their understanding of the world, whatever the subject might be.
This has been a truly deep dive. We've journeyed through this, well, intricate tapestry of human development. It's clear that children and families exist within this incredibly complex web of influences. Psychological frameworks, yes, but also societal structures, diverse cultures, personal attitudes, and the power of individual experiences and relationships.
And seeing how children actively navigate all of this, whether it's figuring out cultural norms, grappling with huge ideas like theology, or facing down systemic barriers like poverty, it really just underscores how critical supportive environments are. Strong relationships, acknowledging all those layers of influence, including the need to address those big systemic issues that impact a family's ability to thrive and support learning.
Yeah. These sources together are just so rich in showing that individuals aren't merely shaped by all their many contexts. they are also actively involved in shaping them in return. It's a two-way street.
Absolutely. So maybe a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away from all this.
Okay.
Consider the different systems in your own life right now. Your family, sure, but also your work or school, your community, your cultural background, even your own current developmental stage. How are all those interacting? How are they influencing you, maybe in ways you hadn't fully considered before this conversation? And how are you, in turn, influencing them?
That's definitely something to chew on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.